Okay, so hopefully you see my screen. Does everybody see the JavaScript LA yellow website?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is where you want to go pretty much to learn about our meetups. I wanted to always just kind of start off with that just so people know about how to reach out to us, and if they have any questions or if they like the content of this meetup, they can pretty much come back to this one central place to get more information about the next meetup. So the name JavaScript LA, that's something that we had been doing for several years. We are slowly changing it to HackBuddy, and basically all of our URLs will be updated. So make sure that you read this post at javascriptla.net just so you're aware of it. The reason for the name change is because we're not really meeting up in LA all the time. We also have branches in OC, and then now because of COVID, everything is more digital. So, like we have people visiting from pretty much everywhere. So it makes sense to just say meet up with HackBuddy as opposed to meet up in LA because there is no meetup there. Hope that makes sense. And then also we want to do like more software engineering beyond just regular JavaScript. So, this gives us kind of like a chance to kind of do some of those things. I will say if you are listening in, just make sure that, like a couple things, right? Like basic stuff, right? Like basic etiquette, when you're in the Zoom call, make sure that you keep yourself muted unless you want to speak. If you have questions, you can use the chat, and somebody, myself, will be kind of monitoring the chat, and I'll ask the questions to Kyle. Or, if you want to quickly unmute yourself, you can also just jump in and ask a question. No problem there. We typically like to wait until the presentation's over just to give Kyle enough time to get through the presentation. Otherwise, that could be distracting. And as always, keep questions and keep content, like anything you want to say, business professional. I know that this is after hours, but still treat it that way. Don't say any like bad language or any like weird stuff during the call, because then you'll be booted. I just wanted to really quickly also mention we have this YouTube channel. That's where the videos are going to go. So you'll want to make sure you come to youtube.com/hackbuddyorg afterwards to watch the videos. And then one other thing is we are now doing a lot of coding together as a remote community. So if you're interested in joining like our open source coding community, you can go to teamhack.org. And it's a cool way to use some of the skills that you learn in a lot of these meetups, a lot of these events. I know for me, right, I don't have the chance sometimes at work to use some of the stuff I may have learned at a workshop or learned at, a meetup. And so I might be busy with a project at work that is just React only, but, I may want to like explore something else like, Gatsby, or, I might want to explore, Angular or something. So this is a good way to kind of, get involved. You just sign up here, and then you can follow us on the GitHub community, which is github.com/team-hack. And then you can go here and start looking at the projects. We're going to be doing some cool stuff. If you want people to check it out. And finally, we have a Discord, so make sure you're on the Discord. And then basically you can ask any kinds of questions you have either in the chat here or to the team hack that I mentioned earlier, which is on this channel. So any questions with all that, let me know. I'm your host Vijay again. Thanks for coming to this presentation. And I'm gonna send it back to you, Kyle. At this time, you can choose to start the presentation, or you can have people kind of introduce themselves. Either way, it's totally fine.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll jump into the presentation, but I do want to mention that I think it's really cool that this is over Zoom. And also not like a presentation style, but more like we all kind of are in the grid, right? So if you at any point in time do want to ask a question or If at any time you have a thought or an idea, I'm totally open to you interjecting and asking it. This is cool because normally, like, if I'm on a stage and there's audience, it's really difficult to like ask questions in the middle. So this is perfect. You can, if like you have a question, much easier to answer it when it's in context. And so, yeah, feel free to ask questions whenever, wherever. Now I am going to attempt to share my screen. I have a weird screen set up. Perfect. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you again so much for coming. I know there's a presidential debate right now, so I know there's a lot of choices of how to spend your night tonight. So really awesome to see everyone here.
Better.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to begin by saying thank you so much for coming. I was just talking to VJ about like all of the last talks that HackBuddy was doing, and I am really stoked about them. I started watching some of the ones on YouTube, and I look forward to joining more in the future. So hopefully this isn't the last time that we see them. Also, if you don't want to ask questions during this talk, like if you have a question but you don't want to like interrupt or even wait till the end, feel free to DM me. My Twitter handle is like a Kyle Boss, and my name is Kyle Boss. So if you find me on LinkedIn or GitHub, you can ping me there, or you can connect and keep in touch for future things. So I went to school at UC Berkeley, and once I graduated, I decided to, I studied computer science there. And once I graduated, I was like, all right, I'm gonna go to the acting capital of the world so that I can fulfill my dreams of paying off my college debt. And I had a few engineering jobs out here, but I most recently landed at Tinder. I've been there for about 2 years now, and it's been an absolute blast. When folks ask me a lot of times, what, like, work at Tinder, isn't that like a native app? What do you do as a web developer? And that is a very fair question because, I mean, when we all think of Tinder, it's what you download on the App Store or the Google Play Store and use natively. Well, what some folks might not know is that we also have a progressive web app. So if you go to tinder.com, you can log in and register there and start swiping in your browser. And that's really cool because it opens up a plethora of possibilities. Like, for example, if you're running low on space on your phone, you don't have to delete any photos or any other apps to make space for us. Also, it's not like necessary that you use it on your phone. You could use it on your desktop or your laptop, in your home office, or who knows, one day maybe even your office. We even have a work mode button. So if you like are swiping in the office and all of a sudden you feel like your boss is behind you, if you click that work mode button, it'll throw spreadsheets at your screen. Now, why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you this because right now we're taking a deep dive into web at Tinder. We have progressive web app and we have several different web properties going on right now. And so if throughout this talk, these projects are something that you'd be interested in, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. My work email is kyle.boss@gotinder.com. And send me your resume, or if you have any questions about the positions that are open, I'd love to hear from you. So let's see if we're a match. Now, I want to start talking about progressive web apps and static site generators, and more specifically, the performance around them. Now, I'm sure performance is important for a lot of folks that are on today. Specifically, performance is good for users, for usability. Like if a user has to wait longer than 100 milliseconds, they're gonna feel it, right? And what's interesting is that like 100 milliseconds is the length of time that it takes to blink your eye. Also, it affects the bottom line. For example, Amazon said that, famously said that every 100 milliseconds of latency costs Amazon 1% in sales. Google DoubleClick also said that mobile sites that load in 5 seconds earn up to 2 times more mobile and ad revenue. So whenever we're making websites, obviously performance is really important. It's something that we always have to keep back in the back of our mind. Now, I want to put a pin there. And I want us to go back to the 1990s. Let's think about what the world was like. In the 1990s, it was a time where you usually had a dial-up connection, right? And you would tell your friends like, hey, don't call me after 7, I'll be on the internet. Or actually during that time, it would be a little bit more expensive to call around 7 to 9 because that was prime time. Also, a lot of commercials would like use the AOL keyword instead of like what we'd call today the Twitter hashtag. And sometimes they say like, go to www.mywebsite.com/index.html. And you'd see that quite a bit. And of course, the internet changed a lot since then. Like we now have new server technologies, new ways to host websites. But obviously the reason why a lot of websites said, hey, go to index.html is because a lot of the websites were fundamentally static. And what that looks like is when a user would make a request like index.html, the server would say, all right, do I have that file in HTML? Oh, I do? All right, that's user. So now that's what static websites look like. That is in stark comparison what websites look like today a lot of times. Today we have a little bit more of a dynamic situation. So when a user hits the server of a dynamic website, what ends up happening a lot of times is that the server is going to concoct a response. It's going to call the API. It's going to hit a database. It's going to call a content management system, right? And it's going to take the responses of all of these requests and concoct this very custom response that's going to give to the user. It's going to give user index.html. The user is hopefully going to be really happy. But remember, every 100 milliseconds that goes by, the user is going to be like, all right, I feel something going on. Like, there's a lot of lag that's happening. And the more API calls, the more database calls, the more CMS calls that happen, the more likely it is the user's going to feel that lag without like proper caching and things like that. Now, this all happens obviously on runtime. Usually for servers, there's a build, but it doesn't take these APIs and database calls and CMS calls into account. Now, this is where the Jamstack comes into play. So the Jamstack I like to think of as something between the static world that we were talking about from the 1990s to the dynamic world of today. It's like a renaissance of the two. Now, here's what I mean. Basically what it does is it takes all the things that happen on runtime, those API calls, the database calls, the calls to the content management system. It takes all of that and pushes it to a build. So here's what that looks like. So when the user makes before the user even makes a request, the build is going to call the API, it's going to call the databases, it's going to call the content management system, and it's going to output a whole bunch of HTML and JavaScript files. This is your static site. And then when the user calls index.html or like request index.html, the server is going to be like, all right, where's index.html? Found it. I'll give it to the user. But note that it was during the build that these API calls, the database calls, and the content management system calls were actually requested. So this at a very high level is what the Jamstack is about. The Jamstack is about taking all of these things that take time, all of these requests that usually happen on runtime right when the user makes a request, and pushes them back to the build. Does that make sense so far? If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can pause and dig through this a little bit deeper. I don't see any yet. Okay, great. One detail that I want to highlight too is that the Jamstack is is basically creating a static website, but it's creating it dynamically. The build is going to be looking at the responses from APIs, databases, CMSs, and creating HTML files accordingly. So where does this name Jamstack come from? It's a really interesting term. The Jamstack stands for JavaScript APIs and Markup. It's a very interesting name because usually you think like, all right, it's an acronym. It's got to have everything that's in that acronym to make sense. It has to have JavaScript APIs and Markup, but for Jam, that's actually not the case. It was coined by the CEO and founder of Netlify, Matt Billman. And he basically said, all right, Jamstack websites usually have JavaScript APIs and Markup, but a lot of them, for example, might not have APIs and still considered Jam. So what does this end up meaning? This means that you could have an index.html file, and that's technically a Jamstack site. But one thing that they all have to have in common is that they're all serverless by nature. Serverless is a buzzword that comes with a lot of other buzzwords. For example, usually they're a bit more scalable. This means that, like, if your website goes viral, you don't have to call DevOps to scale up or down your servers. There was this really interesting example that happened this year of a website that was very scalable, that was on the Jamstack. It was Little Caesars. At the end of last year, Little Caesars moved their really dynamic website over to the Jamstack, and then they ended up having a Super Bowl ad. And the geeky side inside of me was really excited about that because once they had that Super Bowl ad, I knew intuitively, like, all right, it's Jamstack, it's a Gatsby site. So they don't have to scale up or down their servers. They were probably going viral, and they didn't have to do anything about it. So I thought that was really cool. So being serverless also usually means, that you have cheaper costs because you have the economies of scale working for you. You don't have like your own dedicated server. You're using like Amazon's server warehouse and all the servers like behind the curtain. And then finally, fast load times, usually because your static site is on a CDN. And so what that means is that your requests don't have to go across the globe, right? If someone's calling a website that's hosted here in Los Angeles from Australia, if you have your website in front of a CDN that's widely distributed, then hopefully they're going to hit a node that's closer to them, making the response times faster. So, does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, perfect. So I mentioned that websites that, if you create an index.html file, technically that could be Jamstack. But when a lot of people today are saying Jamstack, usually there's this notion or this idea of they're using probably a static site generator. Now, a static site generator is going to be this tool that's going to create a build. It's going to be that tool that calls your APIs and calls your databases, and the one that creates HTML and JavaScript files accordingly. Now, there's plenty out there. There's Next, there's Nuxt, or Vue.js, there's Jekyll, there's Redwood, there's 11T, which is a really cool one that's running right now. But throughout this talk, I'm going to reference one that we use at Tinder called Gatsby. Gatsby's been around the block for quite a while now and is something that has really great documentation. The way that Gatsby works is that on build time, it's going to call APIs. It's going to take all of the API information that it can. It's going to call every single API endpoint that it can that you gave it. And then it's going to take the results and store it into a GraphQL service. Now, this GraphQL service is going to be local in memory. And when all of the information that Gatsby can collect is collected inside of that GraphQL service, what's going to happen is your React app is going to take information from that GraphQL service and pass it to itself via props. So what does this look like? Here's a little bit of code of an example React component. So notice how it's displaying title and content. And this is a post component, by the way. So like imagine displaying a WordPress post or some sort of blog post and we want to display the title and content. Now here we're dynamically, we're basically rendering these two values from the data prop. And this data prop is going to be populated via a GraphQL query. This GraphQL query is going to be at the bottom of post.js. And notice here how we're querying a WordPress post with a specific ID. We're grabbing the title, we're grabbing the content. We could grab the author, we could grab tags, we could grab metadata, but we only decided to grab title and content. So when Gatsby runs its build, it's going to execute all of the GraphQL queries and pass the results of those GraphQL queries back to the component via props. And it kind of treats this GraphQL service as like a central state of sorts. And then it's going to pass it to props, the components that need them via props, and thus the components can render them. So what happens once all that's done? Once it grabs all the information from the APIs, it puts that information inside of a GraphQL service, and then it stuffs it inside of a component. It's going to output a whole bunch of HTML files, a bunch of JavaScript files inside of the public directory. And this is your baby. This is your static website that you can throw up to S3 or any static site host and basically host it serverlessly. Now, with this, you do have a static site, and hopefully this is a bit performant, but I wanted to introduce two tools that Gatsby has that it gives you for free that hopefully will make your site even more performant. The first one's called Gatsby Image. So the way Gatsby Image works is, first, it takes all of your images and optimizes them. So chances are, hopefully you don't have massive images that you're trying to render, but if you do, it's fine, because what Gatsby is going to do is it's going to optimize it. So it's going to optimize images for desktop, for tablet, for mobile, and that way when a user tries to access an image or tries to load an image on a device that doesn't need like a 1000 by 1000 pixel image, it will render the smallest one that it really needs possible. Furthermore, and this is even cooler, Gatsby Image implements lazy loading for you. Lazy loading is a problem or a solution that gets reinvented all the time. With Gatsby websites, it gives you this tool out of the box that you can use. So here's the way that it works. So when you load a website with Gatsby, by the way, I slowed down this network call, but when you load a website with Gatsby and you're using Gatsby Image, it first loads an 8x8 pixel image, like a really small image, and so it's very naturally blurry by design. And then when you scroll into view, that request to the image is actually going to be made, and it's going to blur in. So let's take a look at that again. Now what's cool here is that I slowed down the internet so you can see this transition happening. But on a very fast network, you actually a lot of times don't see this blur coming. And this is important because you want to make sure that your time to first interactive is as quick as possible. So if all of the images, if you don't like load all the images at once and you don't try to render them all, you only render the ones that you need to and request the ones that you need to, hopefully the load times will be a lot faster. So how do we do this? Like, do we get it for free by using the image tag? Not so much. It's a little bit more complicated than that. We use the image component. So notice that there's the capital I image here. And we're not using source, but we're using fixed here, because this is going to be a fixed image for us. But notice like that long daisy chain for the value of fixed. I always have to Google how to add Gatsby images in here because it is a little bit more complicated. But notice, I want you to notice here that the daisy chained object here is data. It's from the data property. And remember, everything that is from data is from our GraphQL queries from Gatsby. This is the GraphQL query that it took to find that image and to have it passed in via prompts. You don't have to worry about what it says exactly, but just know that like it's kind of a complicated query that once you do it once or twice, you kind of get used to it. And it's way simpler than lazy loading, creating like your own lazy loading library or even implementing another one. But there's still a little bit of like tinkering you have to do to get it to work just right. Now, that's Gatsby Image. I want to show you a second tool that Gatsby gives you out of the box called Gatsby Link. Gatsby Link is, in my opinion, even more ingenuous, genius, and also a little bit more simple to use. So the way that Gatsby Link works is it follows it looks like your user's cursor, and if your user's cursor is around a bounding box, like hits a bounding box of a relative URL, what Gatsby Link's going to do is pre-fetch the resources needed to load that page if the user were to click on that link. That way, once they do click on that link, hopefully all of the resources are already on the user's machine, and all the browser has to do is paint it. Here is an example of that. So I opened up the network tab here, and you can see as the mouse hits different URLs, there's new network calls being made. So hopefully, if a user does click on one of those links, the browser already has all the information that it needs to load the next page. Now, of course, this only works with relative links if it's pointing to like an outside URL, like an external URL. It's not going to pre-fetch this information, obviously. Now, also during this network call, you can see that like as the user scrolls, it's also requesting images, and this is because of Gatsby Image. We'll see that here in a second. Cool. So how does one use Gatsby Link? Luckily, it's a little bit easier. Instead of using the anchor tag, you're going to be using a link component. Instead of using like the href attribute, you're going to be using the toProp. So this, for example, goes home, and the relative link for home or index is / right? So with these two tools combined, along with Gatsby being a static site, hopefully your performance is increasing significantly. And one thing to note here too is that with a lot of websites that are on Gatsby, it is relatively easy to use. There's an idea called plugins, and it's really easy to use plugins to make sure your Gatsby site's also a progressive web app using service workers. And so that means like every request that's made, you can cache it. And thus, like with this idea of prefetching and service workers, you can make it so your requests will hit the service worker first. If you have these requests already, these responses already cached, you can just use those cache responses and hopefully make your website even faster. Now, here's the that blog that I was showing you, those examples. When we went live with it, this is what we ended up getting. 98s for performance, SEO and best practices got 100s, 98 for accessibility, and we ended up being a progressive web app. Now, I will pause here. And I want to see if we had any questions about Gatsby Link, Gatsby Image.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you say that it optimizes the images on its own, like, do you know how much, and like, what if you've already optimized your images? Like, is it going to degrade the quality, or do you not want to do that before you use Gatsby Image?
You can, so to be completely transparent, it uses Sharp. It uses Sharp to go in and optimize it. However, to what extent, not entirely sure. I never really played around with the optimizer itself. Usually, like, of course, we want to use optimized images ahead of time, but we've never had an instance where Gatsby would actually optimize. So I've never had to tweak around with it before.
Right. I was just curious about like double optimizing it. Is that going to be too much?
Right. That's always a fear of mine too. Like whenever optimization is built into the build, it's like, all right, do I put in a highly optimized image, or is it going to like make it really blurry once?
Yeah.
Again? I'm curious if anyone on the call knows about this. Does anyone know about the optimization of Gatsby Image and if it will like over-optimize at any time?
I'm guessing.
I mean, I can kind of speak to it. I mean, I've also used Gatsby plugin Sharp, and I know that, I mean, if you want to tinker around with it, I mean, you can. It is just like you said. It was it uses Sharp underneath the hood, which is the image processing tool. What I did was I used like a Drupal site instead of a WordPress site as the backend. And so when I was uploading images there, Drupal already has like an image processing service, but I just disabled it. And I was like, I'm going to use Gatsby and just test it out. And it worked really nicely.
Cool. Thanks for answering that.
For sure. Anybody else with questions? If not, we'll keep going and we'll go from there. I actually am curious to ask you about SEO, but we can come back to that.
Yes, totally. Absolutely.
Okay.
So moving on, now what's interesting here is that the Jamstack is relatively new. Right now, I'd say it's probably around 5 years old since like the term even Jamstack was coined. There's like a lot of like, all right, is the Jamstack just static websites or like is there something more to it? But as we discussed for like this presentation, we're discussing Jamstack as a statically generated website. So it's been around for some time now, but is it still cutting edge technology? What are people using it on? What are some of the projects that people have been using Jamstack for? And to answer that question, I went to Netlify's survey. Netlify is this static web host and static web builder. And they asked their users every single year a few questions just to see like, what's the state of the Jamstack? Where are we at today? And how does that measure up to last year? And where are we going in the future? And they're gonna hopefully map trends to see where it's going. So here are the responses to a cool question that they asked. What types of websites have you worked on in the last 12 months? Now, here are the responses, quite a bit, but I just wanted to point out 2 numbers here that really piqued my interest. The first one is 1 out of every 3 folks said that they worked on enterprise software. And I thought this was huge because Jamstack hasn't been around too long. And usually businesses like to not be on the cutting edge. They usually like to see, all right, let's see if this technology has had success. Let's wait till other folks adopt it, and then we will adopt it. So seeing that 1 out of every 3 respondents said that they're using the Jamstack on enterprise software was telling me that businesses are like, all right, this thing is going to hopefully solve my problems and I'm willing to give it a try. Now, the second number that really piqued my interest here is that 1 out of every 2 respondents, well, 42%, said that they're using the Jamstack on a personal blog. Now, 42% is a lot, and I mean, it didn't really surprise me too much though. In fact, that website that I showed you earlier with Gatsby Link and Gatsby Image, that's a blog in itself. And it's called Swipe Life. It's the first Jamstack website I ever worked on. And it's interesting because think about why most people or a lot of people are using Jamstack with blogs. We have to think about the core of what a blog is. And usually that's like the content management system. It's where the folks write, where content creators write or edit posts. And a lot of times it's also where the engineer lives to make sure that the content is displayed correctly. And so at Tinder, we had this interesting discussion because for our writers absolutely love WordPress. And WordPress is absolutely amazing because it allowed the writers to write their articles, upload images, do any kind of WYSIWYG editing that they needed flawlessly. And it empowered them to be able to create this content efficiently and effectively. So For our engineers, though, we felt like that we love React, right? Our whole pipeline is all based off of us using React, and it's something that we're very, very comfortable with. And so we want to make sure that everyone on our team felt empowered to do their job and to do it well. And for us, we were thinking, all right, it would be great if we could somehow separate these two ideas of content management and content display. If we can pick apart those two pieces of the CMS, it would actually be really nice, because we can let the writers use WordPress and let the engineers use React. And if we squint and look at this issue for a little bit, we can begin to see that Jamstack positioned itself nicely to solve this issue. It allowed us to treat WordPress headlessly and almost use it as a backend. And here's how it worked. So when Gatsby hit the API of WordPress, actually, let me back up. We could tell Gatsby, hey, there's a WordPress out there that has all of our content on it. And here's its API. I actually didn't know this when I started working at Tinder with WordPress and Gatsby, but WordPress has a very, very robust API. It's super RESTful. So if you go to like WP-JSON, WP-v2 /posts, you'll get all of your public posts /authors, you'll get your authors, tags, you'll get all your tags, etc. So what Gatsby will do is it will crawl that API and it'll hit every single endpoint that it can, and then it will stuff all of that information into a GraphQL service. And at this point, hopefully like sparks are going off in your mind, this is a beautiful moment, because you're going to have a copy of your WordPress local on your machine in GraphQL that's queryable by your React components. So when you, for example, want to render a post, your post is going to be basically asking GraphQL, hey, GraphQL, can I have this post information? Thank you very much. And then you can display it using React. And this, for the most part, involves no PHP, or very little PHP, I should say, and mostly React coding. So this is where you can say, all right, I have a React app. I'm going to use my WordPress kind of like a backend, and also the writers can keep using WordPress. The writers don't have to go and write in a custom-made CMS that we create ourselves. They can use like the best of the best tools. So this is where we find ourselves with React and WordPress basically working together using Jam as a solution. Does that make sense? Any questions so far?
I have a quick question.
Absolutely.
I heard that doing this, the writer or author may lose the ability to preview a page. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is very true. That is very true. So at Tinder, we ended up, and this is actually something, oddly enough, we didn't find out until after we created a few articles, after we went live. Then all of a sudden we realized, holy cow, that preview button doesn't work anymore. And the reason why, for folks that might not be following, the reason why the preview button doesn't work is because when we treat WordPress headlessly, we're not telling WordPress, hey, we're using you headlessly. We're just going to use you as a backend. Remove your front end. Like, here's the preview button. Can you point the preview button to the front end? Like, it's really, that's actually not the case. You can't really be like, hey, WordPress, we're using you headlessly. Give us the headless version of you. So how do you fix that? Well, WordPress has an action, I believe it's called. You can redirect the preview button to point to your own your own external website, and it'll pass the ID of the post. And what you're going to have to do is pass along with it a nonce or some sort of like security key. So that way your front end can say, okay, I have a secured request from the WordPress. Here's the nonce. And the front end can make a request back to the back end with the nonce again and say, all right, I'm the front end. Can you give me that information to display? So the preview button functionality does break with WordPress. It's not impossible to fix that preview button, but it's also not like, it's not trivial either. Does anyone else have any questions so far? Or does anyone want to expound upon that preview function? Because that's a big fallback.
That's a great solution, by the way. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's several solutions out there. Nonces aren't the only way to do it. I mean, you obviously want to go with something that's secure, because if you're previewing a post, by nature, that post is probably private, or the changes that you made are not public yet. So that's going to be, it's always a tough issue. And I want to expound upon that even more, because what's going to happen is you're going to have a little bit of dynamicity inside of a static site. So if you can't really like pre-generate a preview, right? So there's going to be parts of your Jamstack site, if you want to develop this preview, that's going to have to talk to the WordPress server. And that's okay. Jamstack websites, for the most part, are static, but there's some dynamic parts to them. For example, on blogs, you usually have search. And with blogs, usually those search queries will hit the WordPress API. That's totally fine. All right, so I want to talk about this really interesting time in the WordPress community. Some of you might have heard about it, but one day I was reading this local news article, like on, I think it was like KCLA or something, and it was just a very simple, normal local news website, the ones that have ads that like are thrown at you as you're reading the website. And when I was reading this article, the white background turned into this succulent. When the succulent had like, was inside of this black pot on top of a wooden table, but like the whole white background turned into this succulent image. And I'm like, okay, something's wrong. Maybe the website's being hacked. Like I figured like something just went wrong with the CMS. And so I went to a different local news website to try and read the same content. But by the time I reached that local news website, they already had that same succulent image, like the succulent inside the black pot on the wooden table. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what is going on here? And it wasn't just like local news websites. At the time, it was TechCrunch, 9to5Mac. They all had succulents as their hero image. And if anyone sees this image and has used WordPress recently, at least like maybe in the last 2 years, you might recognize it. It's actually the default image for WordPress sites. And I realized that at the time after seeing Kyle Frost's tweet, today was a big day for succulents, #WordPress. And CNET caught the story and said that there was a WordPress outage flooding premium blogs with images of succulents. And then the best quote, some sites reverted to their default themes. And words can't describe the amount of like, oh my God, what happened to Swipe Night? Or Swipe Life, sorry. And I mean, my mid-year reviews were right around the corner. I like just was thinking like, oh my gosh, this might be like, Swipe Life might have a big succulent on it. And so I went to Swipe Life, and the long story short is we survived. We didn't have any succulents that were showing up on Swipe Life, thank goodness. And if you stare at the situation for a little bit, it might become a little obvious as to why. We are super dependent on WordPress on build time. On build time, like we mentioned, we're crawling the WordPress API, hitting every single endpoint that we can. But then at the end of the day, Gatsby is just going to give us a bunch of JavaScript and HTML files to host statically. And that means during runtime, we're essentially independent of WordPress. That was a cool feeling to know that we survived the succulent apocalypse. But one interesting fact, this comes with a small little caveat, is that themes on WordPress affect the front end, but also like the back end, the admin panel of WordPress. And we highly customized the admin panel for WordPress for our writers for Swipe Left. So we like added different inputs and things like that for different color backgrounds for different posts. All of those extra things that we created in the theme, gone, because we were reverting to the default theme. And so essentially, our writers couldn't create new content. We couldn't really fix any like big issues with any posts. So that kind of sucked a little bit. However, our readers could still access Swipe Left. They probably didn't know anything wrong was going on. We just couldn't create new content for that time. Also, in the last question that was asked, and the tangent that I went on, the search bar actually also didn't work because the search bar made live API calls to our WordPress. And so our theme edited the API responses, and thus, since the theme was reverted, those didn't work either. So does anyone have any questions about that or any like thoughts? Did anyone see this, by the way? Does anyone already knew about the succulent issue?
Was that this year? When was that?
That was in 2019.
Oh yeah.
Like May. It was a pretty interesting day.
I wanted to ask real quick, I guess,
Yeah.
you know, just, you were saying that, and I kind of know this, but like, I just wanted to like, you know, get a better understanding. So you crawl essentially the WordPress site, right? Like you, during the build process, you just
Right.
you go and, you know, like get everything from WordPress that you need, and then it builds up into, you know, static HTML and JavaScript pages that pretty much you just, you know, send up to, you know, your static site provider, either S3 or whatever.
Sure.
But you were saying that, you know, like some things like the search engine and all of that wouldn't work. Was that on the production site? And
Oh, go ahead.
on the main site, on the Tinder site, the Swipe Left site, was that happening there, that the search engine, I mean, the search bar wasn't working?
Yeah.
Are you making live calls to like the WordPress backend, you know, using just the API?
Yeah, we make live calls to the WordPress backend from the static site, from the production site, and those no longer worked.
I see. Okay. All right. So you are using, you know, live API calls with Gatsby. That's interesting too. I just wanted to find out about that.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting topic because you can make a static website that still makes API calls for things like search. Maybe you have a small widget that does still need to make an API call. Maybe you get to like today's weather or something like that.
Right.
And it's still, and I mean, I guess it depends on who you ask, but most people would still probably consider that a static site. You just want to make sure though, you don't want to make it so that the API call needs to happen before the paint occurs. So like you want to make sure that your website's loaded, hopefully before you start making API calls like that.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so we've been painting the Jamstack here with a pretty positive, like under a positive light so far. And I mean, I want to show why a lot of companies are starting to look at the Jamstack as a viable solution for a lot of their projects. I want to show why Tinder was looking at the Jamstack. However, it'd be like disingenuous of me or for anyone talking about the Jamstack, Gatsby sites, Netlify sites, 11T sites, without touching upon some of the issues that we came across. Now, and I think hopefully this will become probably the most valuable part of the talk, because I asked a lot of the folks on our team who built Swipe Life, who built all the other static sites that we have, if you could go back in time and tell yourself one thing about the Jamstack that you wish you would have known when you started this journey, what would it be? And I compiled the answers, and most of them had to do with one thing, and that's the build times. So one interesting thing with Jamstack is, as we mentioned, we're taking all of these things that happen during runtime and pushing them to the build, optimizing these images, creating the HTML files, crawling APIs. And when you first start with a Jamstack site, you're likely going to have 1-minute builds, 2-minute builds, but as you create more content, as more images come out, you're going to need to optimize more images and continuously create more and more webs, like more pages on your static site. And so that means your build is going to go from like 1 minute, 2 minutes. Eventually, for Swipe Life, we hit 10 minutes. And for us, we're like, holy cow, we need to wait 10 minutes to fix a typo. Then it hit 30 minutes. And then we eventually got to an hour, and then 2 hours. And at the apex of Swipe Life, we ended up having 4-hour builds on a cold cache. On a hot cache, we were able to get it down to 2 hours. And that was crazy. At 4 hours, we ended up, we had code build, and code build would die after 4 hours. You'd have to be like, all right, no, man, please time out after 6 hours. So build times were a big issue. And I want to put a pin there because it is a solvable problem. But I want to go on to the next issue, and we'll go back to how we solve build times. But just keep that in the back of your mind, like the more things that we have to optimize, the more calls we have to make, the longer the build times are going to be. So the next issue that I want to talk about is the build infrastructure. So when one of our writers hits update, what happens? Well, from our WordPress, we're an AWS shop, by the way. So from our WordPress, we're going to post to an API gateway. And the API gateway is just going to make our code pipeline more public attached to a URL. So the code pipeline is going to be kicked off. And then what the code pipeline does, obviously, is pulls our Gatsby code, our React code from GitHub, and then brings it to code build. And by the way, if these names are unfamiliar, don't worry too much. It's the big idea here that I want to pass on is the complexity. So code pipeline will pass the code from GitHub to code build. And what code build will do is it will take this cache that I mentioned quickly about earlier, it will pull it, and then it will make the build. And at the end of the build, at the end of 4 hours, for example, you will have files in your public S3 bucket. And you will want to have your S3 bucket behind a CloudFront CDN, so it's faster, and it's heavily cached and distributed throughout the globe. And that allows us to do cool things like have Lambda at edge attached to it. So we have a request Lambda that hijacks the request, and if we detect that the user is, for example, coming from a browser whose language setting is set to French, we can redirect them to the French site. We also have like CMPs, like more security on our response Lambda. And of course, we want to recreate all of this for, like, for example, a staging environment. We want to be able to do it easily and not do it by hand. So we have a CloudFormation. And so this ecosystem, you have to create yourself. And as you create it yourself, it's not going to be perfect. For example, I want to talk about these caches really quickly. The S3 caches get large. Like, for example, they could get to gigabytes and gigabytes large. So a lot of times you have to pull in that S3 cache, which can take 30 minutes or 20 minutes itself. And then you have to push it back, which can take another 20 to 30 minutes. Gatsby builds can run 30 minutes. So you have this complex infrastructure, but it's not all doom and gloom. You can use third-party services. There's Netlify, which I touched upon a couple of times, which will build your site and host it. If you're a hobbyist, if it's a hobby website, you can do it's free. Obviously, there's enterprise costs there if you're an enterprise customer, but they will be able to do it with a cache There's also, if you're using Gatsby, there's Gatsby Cloud, which will build your website, but you'll still need to find a web host for it. And the cool thing about Gatsby Cloud is they're made by Gatsby. So it knows what makes Gatsby tick. They allow you to do incremental builds. So for example, if you have a typo, you don't have to like rebuild the entire site. You have the option to only build a single page. But there's options out there. But this is what we decided to do for Tinder, for Swipe Life, and for all of our other static websites. And lastly, internationalization. That's something that's solvable. It's something that's possible. Like I mentioned, Swipe Life had internationalization, but it's heavily dependent on what your static host is and on each specific project. There's no like general solution for internationalization just yet on the Jamstack. Depending on your host, you might have to change your URL structure, for example. But yeah, those are the three issues: build times, the build infrastructure, and internationalization is a big one too. All right, so I am almost done talking. I know this is a lot of talking, but I wanted to say thank you so much for having me. This has been absolutely amazing. And I'm gonna stick around after for questions as well. But one day at Tinder, some of the staff members and employees realized that something was missing in this world. We realized that at the time there were different skin tones for certain emojis. Like all the waving emoji had skin tones, all the emojis with one face had skin tones. But for some reason, the hand-holding couple emoji or any emoji that had more than one person, the skin tones were left behind. You weren't able to choose like respective color skin tone for a specific person inside of the hand-holding couple emoji, the kissing emoji, the love emojis. And obviously that means that a lot of representations and identities were left behind in the Unicode set in the day. So what we ended up doing is creating a change.org petition. This change.org petition is basically our stance saying, hey, we would love to have this introduction to the Unicode set, these interracial couple emojis. And once we went live with that change.org petition, it spread like wildfire. It went across the country and across the globe. The CEO of Reddit at the time shared it across all of his communities as well. And we quickly realized that we had a viral movement on our hands. And in order to make sure that we put a face to this movement that's a little bit more professional and all the more personal than online petition, we want to make a viral landing page of sorts. We want something that we could point news organizations to, something that folks on Reddit could share, and hopefully it gets to the top page. So we looked for two characteristics on what a viral landing page would look like. The first is we wanted it to be scalable. And what this for us means is we just don't want to be DDoSed by like getting to the top page of Reddit. if someone shares the URL and a lot of people hit it, we don't want it to go down. We don't want to have to like make quick midnight calls to DevOps and say, hey, scale up our servers, please. So we want it to be scalable. Furthermore, we wanted to have a quick launch. We wanted to make sure we met the movement where the movement was at. We didn't want to wait 3 weeks or 4 weeks until after everyone signed the petition to come out with this. We wanted to make sure that it came out now. And so for scalability, we decided we wanted to be serverless. And for quick launch, do we hire more devs? Do we put more devs on this project? That was talked about, but that's usually not the answer. We decided that we just want to do it in React and go quickly with it. And so what allows us to code in React and make sure that our website is super scalable and loads really fast? The Jamstack, right? So one of our team members, Brendan Thodaro, he put his head down for 5 days straight. And at the end of the week, he came out with the Represent Love project's launch page. And this was really cool because once we came out with this, the buzz really started being generated across the internet. I mean, Twitter was talking about all of the Represent Love representations throughout the world. We had a full page ad in the New York Times. And also in the middle of this, like, we ended up winning something called a Webby Award. And for those not familiar with the Webby Awards, it's kind of like the Grammys for websites and for web companies. And it's really fun because they have, in non-COVID times, a dinner, an awards show almost. And at this awards dinner, they have a stage. And if you win, you don't get 2 minutes for your award speech. You get 5 words. And ours were, thank you for swiping right. So that wasn't the end though. That's like, that happened during this petition going viral. And months went by, and eventually one day the news came out that the Unicode Consortium had made the decision to introduce interracial couple emojis into the next Unicode set. And I mean, obviously this is not because of our launch website, but it was such a huge moment. And the launch website was a small piece of it. And no matter how much traffic went to it, the website never went down. And we were able to create it quite quickly. And it was accessible to people all over the world. Now, one last update, Apple in iOS 13.2 came out and introduced the interracial couple emojis into their keyboards. And Android as well has it right now as well. So if you take out your phone, give the couple hand-holding emoji a long press, you will be able to choose the skin tones of each person in the emoji respectively. So if you want to check out this project, feel free to head to our Jamstack Gatsby website at emoji.tinder.com. And with that, I think I will close this out. First, thank you so much for coming. I am going to stay as long as we need to. Would love to answer any questions that you might have that are lingering. Again, if you are looking for a job, if these websites sound exciting, like something you'd love to work on, feel free to send me your resume at kyle.boss@tinder.com. And I want to leave everyone with this. Empowering everyone on our team is really important. Obviously, you want to empower your users to get the website as fast as possible on all types of internet speeds. You want to empower your writers to make sure that they can create content efficiently and effectively. And obviously, you want to also empower your engineers to be able to create products using the best tools that they can. And we ended up doing this with a little bit of innovation, empowering everyone involved on the team. And that's what engineering is all about. So let's keep innovating, guys. Thank you.
All right, yeah, awesome presentation, Kyle. Thank you so much for sharing your history with Gatsby and like the process, walking us through like how you designed and engineered that site. So a lot of great stuff there. I do want to give everybody a chance to first ask questions before I kind of start asking questions. But if people are kind of shy or whatever, you know, feel free to use the chat and I'll read the question for you as well. Or you can, you know, let me drive if you don't have anything, because I have a lot of questions too. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear somebody.
I just thought I'd pipe up if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, Kyle, hi, my name's Kevin. A little while ago, before Gatsby was around, I looked across Check and quickly built a personal website using some templates. And then I discovered Gatsby, but it was a while before Gatsby was getting out there, and I couldn't find any templates. So in terms of like getting up to speed quickly with a good-looking, but not dead simple template was a challenge I couldn't figure out at the time. The basic Gatsby blog template is nice, but super simple. It doesn't have very many options. So I'm just wondering what's going on in the space of templates and, I mean, because WordPress has that galore, did when I looked into it once upon a time.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a very good question. So they recently came out with something called Gatsby themes, which is like shared functionality of a site, which can be design, or it can be like theme in the term of like code, like shared code on the starter kit. I totally share your thoughts that like there's not too wide of a like a starter kit that has certain designs and themes that you can like start working with. There's like the basic default starter. I believe they do have like a library of sorts of themes, but I don't want to like mislead you, but I believe I saw something like that recently for getting started. But I'm scared.
Yeah, I haven't dug deep recently, but I just saw this when I saw this presentation on the calendar. Oh, that'd be great. And this was one thing that was on my mind, but I haven't done any research in the last days. This was all from like a year ago or so.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of work, I mean, coming out of Gatsby recently. So I would take a look at the Gatsby themes. I think there's like I'll post actually, yeah, I don't want to like mislead you, but I believe there is something new out there like within the last few months that they released. So I'm not really too certain on like a theme library.
And by the way, on a quick personal note, Kyle, I clicked onto your LinkedIn page and we have a mutual acquaintance, my friend Linda Watkins.
Oh, Linda's amazing.
Yeah, I've known her for years. Pardon?
She works at Gatsby. She's their PR person.
Yep.
She's really cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice meeting you.
Good to meet you too.
Kevin, just to answer your question real quick, I put a link in the chat for use cases. So, I mean, like for me, this talk is really important too, just because like I had been using Gatsby for quite a while. I met Kyle actually at the Gatsby conference, like way back. I think, when was this, Kyle? Was this the beginning of the year?
It was in January. It was February. It was the day after the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And Little Caesars ad went out.
Yeah, just right before COVID, like, you know, and I remember like at that time, like I was kind of like mind blown by a lot of stuff, you know, Kyle was saying, and, you know, just in general, right? You know, I think everything he was saying as far as like building sites, you know, kind of in this static site generator way, as opposed to, you know, doing it kind of like the old way where you build stuff on like some kind of, you know, CMS tool, like, you know, Laravel or WordPress or something like that, right? And so I had been following this Gatsby community for quite a while. And I think like there's a lot of great stuff in the ecosystem. You know, like, you just have to kind of deep dive. But if you go to their main site, Gatsby.js, right? They have a lot of like use cases, which is the first link I shared. It's the gatsbyjs.com/use cases. And I think they have a lot of examples that you can look at to kind of fast build and fast prototype like a website. So it's really cool. You know, I think like if you're somebody in design, you know, and you're kind of trying to learn how to make like a cool looking website, Gatsby has a lot of resources already that you can kind of like mimic or kind of like take from in terms of inspiration. So I would explore themes, recipes, and plugins. Those are like the main ones that you'll want to go and check out. And you'll have a lot of fun with that stuff.
Cool. Thanks for those links.
For sure.
I want to highlight too, they're called starters. I just put a link in there too. But one caveat is that I have tried a couple of starters. They are slightly opinionated. So like you might, like if it's like an e-commerce theme, I think it might be very difficult to move it over to a blog, for example. But anyway, there's a bunch of starters out there. But yeah, starters was the word I was looking for. And it looks like Cesar also posted a link. Oh, by Lake Arts.
Yeah, and actually to that point, there is I think like there's a pretty good e-commerce one that links up with Shopify as a backend. I remember we had a talk about that.
Yeah, by Trevor Harmon. I will post the.
Yeah, if you remember that link, that would be great. I think we can try to get him for like another presentation. That'd be really cool if you can put in a good word for us, Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely. He has this blog title of his talk called "Sell Things Fast with Gatsby and Shopify," and it's fabulous. It's absolutely amazing. But I put the link in there. But Shopify apps and Shopify themes is like a really good idea with Jamstack, because I mean, if speed increases revenue, and you want to basically create a very performant website that's heavily cached, Jamstack is a good option.
All right, we can go to more questions if people have them, because I want to give people a chance to really ask. So be sure to jump in now. And I guess if you're not ready yet, like just go ahead and leave something in the chat. I'll ask some questions because I know I had some. You mentioned earlier that you know, you had a perfect SEO score. That's something that like I haven't figured out how to do just yet with Gatsby. I'm still kind of seeing, you know, on my site like some you know, some scores kind of like in like the 50s and 60s. So I was just kind of like wondering, what are some tips and tricks to kind of like, you know, take advantage of stuff that you can do?
That's one thing, totally good question. Like that's one thing that we added on the WordPress theme. We added a lot of extra fields for metadata. So if you're looking at the WordPress example, there's this plugin that you can use called Advanced Custom Fields, or ACF.
Okay.
Use ACF fields quite a bit to be able to allow our writers to say, all right, with this image, here's the alt tag that we use. With here's a description of the author. Also, you want to be able to do the schema. Like we were very big on adding a schema, and this reminds me of the sitemap. With Gatsby sites, there's this idea of plugins as well, and there's this plugin called Gatsby plugin sitemap, which allows you to generate a sitemap with all of the pages that are created automatically. So if you add a new blog post, it will automatically create a sitemap. But yeah, but that SEO score, like performance was definitely like a big thanks to Gatsby. But with SEO, obviously like it's a balance between like, obviously we have to do like a lot of developer work as well to make sure that score is high.
Sure.
Gatsby definitely helped with it, like generating like the sitemap and stuff.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of, like also like manual work creating those ACFs.
Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. That's a good helpful suggestion because I was, I wanted to kind of research that next. I kind of like put it off as far as like, because like I was like you too, trying to figure out how to like, kind of, do the whole like microservices, re-engineering a little bit with AWS. I think you kind of touched on it too, but you kind of talked about, and I took a picture of it. So like, cause I wasn't sure what the names were myself. But let me see here. I think it was something about, oh yeah, okay. So you're using code pipeline, code build, S3 webbucket, request lambdas, and CloudFront with S3 cache. So was that something, okay, so you set up, like, to my understanding, right? You set up the code on GitHub, and then you create the code pipeline in AWS, and then you let it build, and then that outputs to S3, is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what are you using the request lambdas for on the CloudFront side? For my understanding, CloudFront is basically like, the thing that kind of sits in between S3 and your URL. Is that correct too?
Exactly. So Lambda Edge is really, really cool. Absolutely love it. So what our request Lambda does is it hijacks the request, and we are able to manipulate it. So like if they go to swipe life, like the URL for swipe life, and we detect that they're using if they're a French user, then we can say, all right, we're going to redirect you to swipelife.com/fr. We can also look at their cookies and see like if they manually change their language. And we can say, all right, they manually said that they speak Spanish. And so we can redirect them to Spanish instead.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. And we
Okay.
also do some URL cleanup. So like if for some strange reason they like tacked on /index.html to the URL, we'll chop that off there.
Yeah.
We prettify the URL basically as well. But we manipulate and form the request the way that we see fit in there.
Okay.
It's cool for A/B testing too. You can
Yeah, yeah.
into different sites.
That makes a lot more sense to me. Like I understand now like why you're doing those requests lambdas. Like it basically kind of like helps kind of redirect to the right S3 bucket. Is that correct?
Yeah. It helps with all the logic that you lose by going serverlessly. It kind of brings it back.
Exactly, right. Because you're kind of like doing it over all these weird microservices as opposed to having your own integrated server at home.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Does all the server logic for you.
Okay. And you set that up, or you kind of work with everybody to do that?
Yeah, the team. So like everything that I showed today, like it was a team effort.
Okay.
And yeah, to be honest, like Jamstack was totally new to me. So this was like something that over the years I've perfected with like alongside with the team.
Okay. Very awesome. I'll hand it back to, I think there's some comments. I'm not sure. I wasn't looking, but does anybody else have questions? I mean, is this talk kind of like super advanced for some people? And you're just kind of like scared? Like, let us know, like whatever you want, right? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, want to make sure everybody here kind of walks away with something, some kind of understanding.
I guess I can go. Hi, Kyle. My name's Adam. Hey, so I guess my perspective, or I guess I will form a question as I'm talking.
Totally fine.
My experience is really like PHP, right? I've done a little bit of WordPress. I've obviously done React, and so I guess it seems like Gatsby is really just kind of the ability for you to focus on kind of like building a static site in React, and then kind of not having to worry about the second part,
Yeah.
where everyone gets messed up and caught up on the full stack. But still, like, it's still functional, right? Still, it works. And it seems like with the integration of the CMS, as you alluded to with the whole API, basically scouring, collecting all that information and kind of making something. So that way you don't have to, do the hooks, right, for WordPress to do certain things. You can call the API to activate that stuff.
Exactly.
So I guess Well, I guess I'm interested. Well, because I feel pretty comfortable. Feel comfortable with the front end. But I guess is it a crazy concept to create a website, or with your experience doing it with this WordPress way, as opposed to, I'm sure you've seen things spin up on WordPress environments and all that. So I guess is it a hard transition for somebody who has experience with WordPress? Kind of has to. I have a feeling you probably have to
Yeah.
It's probably good to know certain things of that, but some of that stuff you probably have to take away, right?
No, absolutely. I would say honestly, before I say this, I want to say that literally any static site generator out there is going to probably fit anyone's needs. Depending on if you're familiar with Vue, it's probably Next or Nuxt. 11t is really good out there and probably just as good as Gatsby, if not more. In fact, in that Netlify survey, even though 11t is brand new, a lot of people say that they really like it. But that being said, Gatsby has amazing documentation. They hire full-time folks such as Marcy Sutton, Lori, Aisha, folks that are absolutely amazing code writers and also just amazing blog writers to make their documentation. And so I wouldn't say it's too far-fetched for someone maybe not familiar with Gatsby or React or GraphQL to just jump in and start trying out these starter kits with the documentation in hand. I don't think that's going to be too difficult. And if you're working on a WordPress blog specifically, I think you will be able to more easily create I feel like I'm stating the obvious, though. It'll be more easy to create the blog since you have all of this WordPress experience. You can say, all right, here's how I edit the API. Here's how I work with advanced custom fields and pass them into the API for Gatsby to consume. So it's not too far-fetched with how neat the documentation for Gatsby is.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh. And if you have if you have any ideas for cool Jamstack ideas, would love to hear them, or any cool blogs that you're thinking of using Jamstack for.
Somebody asked.
Cool question.
Oh, go. Okay. We'll come back to you in a minute, Kevin. Somebody asked, have you used Next, and how does it compare to Gatsby?
Oh, that's a good question. I have not used Next because I'm not too familiar with Vue. I'm pretty sure Next is the Vue equivalent. So I haven't used Next yet.
Yeah. Well,
but I heard a lot of cool things about it. Has anyone here used Vue? Or sorry, Next?
So basically, I have a friend, right, who is at Beachbody, right, and he and their team are using Next, and they were asking, I guess, a lot of questions about Gatsby, because I had kind of gone to that particular conference, and they're just trading notes. My understanding, at least, is that they're basically almost identical, right? The only difference is that you get a little bit more server-side configuration with Next, where you can kind of control sort of the GraphQL and exactly what goes into that. Whereas with Gatsby, it's kind of it reads with CMSs already in the works. So, but the cool thing about Gatsby is that it actually takes care of that for you. It builds you the GraphQL server, so you don't have to actually tinker with that and try to figure out that too. They made it really kind of simple to just kind of do React because that's what people want to do, right? I feel like that's why it's in my opinion, it's kind of just as cool. But there is a conference next week, and I think a lot of people on this call should go to that conference. I think it's with Next.js conference. I think you can just look it up on Google. And you can get the cliff notes. But yeah, if anybody else here has anything to add to what I was saying.
Do they, quick question, do they both use the pages where it's you use the directory to create your pages? Or is that just Next?
Gatsby does that too. So
Gatsby does that as well? Okay.
Yeah, so if you have a page that you just want to always have created, For example, an about page at
Right.
yourwebsite.com/about. Yeah, you just add about.js to the pages directory, and it'll create.
Yeah, it's so much fun. I love that. I just, it's so
Yeah.
quick to just create a route.
Yeah, totally.
So, oh, sorry. Like, so I shared a link to a comparison between Gatsby and Next.js. It was on Gatsby.js's website. I remember like seeing this a while back, and it really does a good job of kind of like outlining feature versus feature.
Oh, this is beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Oh, very cool. This is very helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So like, I mean, that's why I'm saying like, they're pretty similar. I mean, if you learn one thing, you can take a lot of the skills that you learned to like the other thing. And that's really great because like, you don't have to go like, oh my God, I have to relearn something else now. It's like, so time consuming. It's just kind of like, no, like you have your React skills, you can use that and you can build with the next site or you can build with the Gatsby, whatever you like, right? Kevin, I think you had a question.
Yeah, silly question. I've used WordPress a lot, and I've used Veneva as a headless CMS. I've also written a lot in Markdown outside of WordPress, but I'm just wondering if on like the swipe right side, for instance, if one of the writers wanted to write in Markdown, would it be easy to whip that up, or is it kind of incompatible with this WordPress-centric thing for most of the writers?
No, that's a good point. So it's actually very easy to use Markdown or like MDX, if you're familiar with that. So like there's a Gatsby plugin I'm looking at right now that basically takes your MDX files, your Markdown files, and turns them and basically imports them into GraphQL. And then they'll be available in the GraphQL central store as well, with your WordPress and with your other with your other.
Oh, and your GraphQL store would be part of your workflow, so it wouldn't be a big issue to have two ways into that.
Exactly.
Store.
So
cool.
What's even cooler too is like, let's say you have multiple sources, you have WordPress and then like another CMS like Contentful. You can grab information from both of those and have them in the GraphQL too. So so you can grab from multiple locations. But I posted in the chat the Gatsby plugin MDX. And what that will do is it will basically look for your MDX files and import that information into your GraphQL central state, your store.
Yeah, and I mean, I would love it. I mean, if you, Kyle, or if you knew somebody who wanted to kind of like jump in from Tinder, whoever, right? I mean, if you wanted to kind of have like a follow-up, some presentation on plugins, because I feel like that's where Gatsby really, really does shine. It's like, yeah, there's a lot to learn kind of initially, but then like you realize, oh, it has all these amazing plugins, and if you, like add them in, it's so easy to add them in first off, right? Like it does so much work, like the image sharp thing that you mentioned at the beginning and the SEO. I feel like that itself is like huge, tremendous value to any team.
Absolutely. There's several must-haves. Like for example, offline, the one that I just put in there. There's Manifest as well for like your progressive web apps. But yeah, I totally agree. There's so many cool plugins. There's several essential ones that I absolutely love, such as those two, and Gatsby Image that we already talked about.
Right.
But there's Gatsby plugins for style components and things like that. Anyway, there's tons of plugins, but that's a good idea. We should talk about that. I would love that.
Okay. Yeah, anytime. Let me know too, like how you are on time. Are you getting tired? You want to keep going a little bit, or
totally fine to keep going. Absolutely.
Okay. Won't keep you that much longer. I do want to respect your time, obviously.
Absolutely.
But yeah, feel free to jump in, anybody.
When I saw Jeff's question,
Yeah.
does Tinder have any like internal documentation? Is it like documentation on like Gatsby or?
Yeah, dev docs.
Oh, using Gatsby. Is that the question? Like, do we use Gatsby for internal dev docs? Oh, yes. No, we don't. And that is such a good use case. In fact, someone at the conference that VJ and I met at actually gave a talk on how to use Gatsby for internal docs. I think it's a really good idea and something that companies would benefit from. Do we do it? Not yet, but it's something that we've always thought about for like
Yeah,
a extra mile project.
Yeah, documentation always tends to be like the last thing that the companies look at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think it's a stellar idea and something that a lot of companies should look at least.
Does at Tinder, do they have a storybook? I mean, are they using Storybook React to kind of like create some of these components? And then like, do you kind of look at that and then develop from that? Do you, do kind of like unit testing, for before you kind of like push these components out for your Gatsby, or how does that look?
For Gatsby, no. For our Gatsby projects, we don't do that.
Okay.
That's something that we would like to add to. Like, it would be really nice to add inside of that code build testing as well, like a testing framework.
Yes.
Has anyone else done that, by the way, here on the call? And how has it worked very well? I'm definitely would love to hear any feedback on how that goes or how that went.
Yeah, and even afterwards too, like if you're not sure, I mean, you can send like a message afterwards, or if you're watching it on YouTube later, totally.
Totally.
Okay, yeah, like, no, I was just like curious because like I think like I had the same question. I was kind of like wondering, maybe I should do some of this unit. Maybe I should just like use like the default, stuff that comes with React, Jest, and Enzyme or something like that. I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, I'm very curious to hear how that goes because that, like, obviously you'd have to like, and you have the data prop, and as long as you stub that out, like it should work relatively fine. But I've never tried it, so I can't say for sure. But I'd love to hear, like, yeah, someone like has an experience. That'd be awesome to know.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm good on like my questions that I keep asking all night. But, like, I think like if anybody else wants to jump in, go ahead. If not, then we'll call it a night, and just we'll keep in touch with you, Kyle. Like, we definitely enjoy this presentation. And I think like this is a great like first step into kind of just learning about like this new ecosystem, Gatsby, and even static site building. Are there, I guess, like back to you, right? Like, are there any things that you want to like just kind of like say in kind of closing about Gatsby, or new things you looked at since that conference?
Absolutely. So yeah, the conference that you and I met at was about 9 months ago.
Yes.
There's been a lot of developments since then. As I mentioned in the talk, there's Gatsby Cloud. Gatsby, like for what it's a for-profit, it's a company, so they're developing a lot of products along the way with the framework. But that's not to say that you have to pay to use the framework. I want to make that clear. Like, you don't have to. It's free. It's for the most part like open source. But also there's employees out there that are actually like actively working on making the framework and tools around it better. So there's new things all the time. Check out the Jamstack Conf that is run by Netlify, that host and builder. They have a lot of good videos about like who's using the Jamstack. For example, the COVID tracking project, really impressive use case of the Jamstack that collects COVID data. And that is like me and my partner were watching the news yesterday that literally quoted the COVID project.
Wow.
That's a Jamstack site.
Yeah.
Using Next or on a Netlify. Anyway, so there's a lot of cool use cases. We mentioned Shopify, the COVID tracking project, blogs, documentation. And if you ever have any questions about like anything Jamstack related, for example, you're building that architecture and you're like stumbling upon it, or if you have any shout outs or suggestions, feel free to shoot them my way.
Of course.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, thank you so much for telling me that. That's awesome. All right. Well, yeah, like think thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Kyle, for this awesome presentation. And we will hopefully see you again sometime. You're welcome to also join us for future meetups too. I know some people are kind of like here in secret, like that have already given talks, but you know.
Yes, you'll see me in the future for sure.
Yeah.
I'm super excited about this. So excited to like have finally been a part of HackBuddy and JavaScript LA.
For sure. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.